everybody wants to feel seen, and that's probably why you're drawn to an inquiry-based approach to teaching, of course, and learning in the classroom space. And as leaders, we need to model the model, right? If our teachers are not feeling empowered, how do they know how to empower their students? If our teachers are not feeling curious, how are they going to cultivate and create spaces of curiosity in their classroom? So I think that phrase, model the model, although quite simplified, is really something to hang our hats on and to consider that if we want this for others, then we need to be acting in those spaces as well too.
Hello and welcome to Blooming Curious, a podcast that's all about nurturing that natural curiosity in our early years kids and students. I'm Edwina, your host from the Ed's Lessons blog, a passionate advocate for play and inquiry, and on a mission to keep children curious and questioning. The days of talk and chalk are over. We're diving into the world of integrated, inquiry and nature-based learning and exploring the strategies that create lifelong learners. So if you're a classroom or homeschool educator or even a curious parent, then this is the place for you. This morning, we welcome Jessica Vance, who has a professional teaching and leadership background in both private and public international schools as an IB PYP educator and PYP coordinator. Her passion for student-centered learning, collaboration, and coaching stems from the students themselves, finding inspiration in their natural curiosity. Her journey and experience as an inquiry educator in IB schools and place-based education fuels her passion and global work in coaching both teachers and leaders in their roles, as well as supporting schools in implementing inquiry-based learning. Jessica understands the power of curiosity to guide next steps and actively engage in reflective practice. In her newest publication, Leading with a Lens of Inquiry, she outlines the ways in which leaders need to support and facilitate teachers in the same ways as in which teachers engage with their students. Welcome to Blooming Curious, Jessica Vance. It's awesome to have you on Blooming Curious.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here. Of course, getting to connect with you virtually is always a treat. So it's been a minute. So happy to be here, Edwina.
And isn't it wonderful having, I'm a bit anti-technology for many reasons when it comes to kids, but I'm just loving the fact that we can connect and you can connect with so many other like-minded people across the world. That's just, for me, an incredible, amazing thing that technology gives us. Jess, let's start out. I've just read out your very impressive bio, but I'd love you to share with us how your passion for inquiry started. What started this journey for you that's led you to where you are now?
Yeah. So, the best laid plans actually never come to be, right? I started in a traditional school, at a private school, actually in Southern California. And my husband and I ended up moving to Austin, Texas. And I found myself teaching IB, which I didn't know what it was at the time, at an elementary school. And I remember being interviewed and the principal was like, "It's just best practice. You'll love it." And I didn't know what I was jumping into. And boy, oh boy, did I jump headfirst and loved how non-traditional it was. My head was spinning with, just the different approach and ways to honor the learner, but figure out how do I unlearn all the things that I thought that I knew about teaching and relearn a different approach to my practice. So started to teach in elementary classroom, grade 5, and then also grade 3. And, was always really inspired by leaders ever since I was a student teacher. And so knew that that was something that I eventually wanted to grow into, and had the opportunity to be an IB coordinator at another IB school. And so got to stretch my wings in that way. And again, just kind of leading adults in the same way that I was facilitating learning in the classroom just felt really natural and normal. My principal at the time, I really appreciated her feedback that first year. She's like, "I don't really have any feedback to give you." And I said, I was like itching for more, like, tell me more, like, how can I get better? Or what other things can I learn? And she's like, you just seem to really naturally fall into it. And I think I just, like I did with students in the classroom, is really attuned to adult learners and really became curious to lead and learn alongside them. And so have, taken leadership and of course authored a book because of that, and have gotten to take authorship and consultancy and leadership around the globe, which is, gosh, again, nothing I quite imagined when I thought about being a leader.
I loved how you've explained how you just naturally fell into this whole role, you know.
Okay.
I interviewed Claire Warden a few weeks ago, actually, and we were talking about curiosity. And she
Mhm,
was saying about supporting those of us or those colleagues who, she said, some people would just naturally, like you just said yourself, you just naturally are that way inclined. And
mhm,
other people need more support, which is, I think, where you coming in with your coordinator role. So
mhm,
you're very much, Jess, you're very much the expert on inquiry based learning
mhm,
and learning walls specifically. And now I want to put my hand up and just say that I have actually never used learning walls in the way that you do them. I've
mhm,
always used floor books more for sharing the learning journey and planning.
mhm,
But
mhm,
I'd love you to talk us through the process of learning walls and how educators that haven't used them, for example, can get
mhm,
started in them.
mhm,
Because if, I think there's a distinction, right, between a
mhm,
learning wall and a
mhm.
display. So I think many
Yes.
of us have done displays, but a
Mhm.
learning wall is something totally different. And how do those learning walls connect to inquiry?
Yeah, so I'm currently writing this publication all about learning walls because there's so many things to unpack. And to be honest, Edwina, when I say that I follow the learners and attune to them, this was not my original plan for my second book. But really, again, just listening to the questions and seeing where they take us or have taken me. So again, of course, lots to unpack that I'm excited to be able to release later on this year. But as it relates to learning walls, again, it came from my learners. I was working with a couple of first grade teachers at the IB school, and we were reflecting on a unit of inquiry, and they felt really frustrated that students weren't making transdisciplinary connections. They couldn't figure out why they couldn't do it. And it was a really dynamic and very open minded team, to be honest, really willing to take risks and try new things and honestly ask that question. And so, honestly, when they asked that question, I responded to them in a question, as I often do. And
Yes.
I said, well, what would happen if we took all of the learning that you have surrounding the classroom, and instead of having a math wall, a reading wall, a science wall, we put it into one space so that way it drew us towards a wall and that we continue to use it as a tool. This is not something so foreign to the IB. If you have listeners who are familiar with the IB, there's usually an IB board or your IB unit of inquiry. And I definitely had an IB unit of inquiry wall as well that I did not take advantage of. And it was more a display. It was definitely not a learning wall. Um, and so, when if somebody says, what is a learning wall? How is it different to a display? I'd say, it's another tool that we can use to leverage and document and celebrate and show that we value the process of learning. A display usually is that end product or that final piece of writing or maybe some beautiful artwork or a collection of photos. And it's usually a single handed effort, right? Or maybe we grab some of our colleagues to help us staple some of the artifacts up there. But it's usually one vision, one direction. And there's nothing wrong with a display, but just like Reggio Emilia research says that space really is a third teacher. And it's a missed opportunity for us to not leverage our walls as an opportunity to be able to support and co-construct the learning alongside our little or big learners, if you will, throughout our units of inquiry. So I would say that's probably the qualifier of what it is or what it isn't and where the idea came from. Again, always responding to learners. You had asked, though, how do you get started? Yeah. So I'd say, and from facilitating learning together and getting to engage with one another, that setting an intention. So, what's your intention for this space? Is it to be able to focus on an entire unit of inquiry that lasts a span of 6 weeks, centered on a concept? Are you really trying to harness vocabulary, and do you want to have tiered vocabulary wall that is still rooted in the tenets of a learning wall, but is really something that's co-constructed together alongside your learners. As a school leader, I create several different learning walls, both with administrators on the same team, school learning wall, if you will, to document the school learning that we're doing together. And then a couple of additional learning walls this year have bubbled up. I've been doing some support work for our educational assistants this year. So they have their own learning wall that's documenting the things that we're unpacking together. And then the fourth wall in that space that I share is for our grade level leaders in developing their leadership skills. And so the walls interchange based off of the learning and things that are unfolding. So an intention is the first step. And how do you do that? I worked with a leader just last week and he printed off an email. And then there was a teacher who grabbed an artifact from a provocation. And then there's another leader that I worked with who grabbed a sketch note, and that was going to be the start of their wall. So the intention is set, and then choosing an artifact to anchor and build off of would be first two starts, I'd say, for your listeners.
Gosh, as you were talking there, my brain started racing. And I kind of thought about this almost a spider web on a wall.
I love that.
Where you would be connecting, right? Because as you were saying about making cross-curricular connections, so you could really make it visible for students as how this unit of work actually links to their English narrative or their persuasive text or whatever it is that they're writing, as well as vocabulary, as well as perhaps even their art or experiments or whatever it might be. And as you've been talking, I've been sort of thinking, oh, geez, that would be a nice thing to start because very often, and I think this is where inquiry is so powerful, is that it makes these cross-curricular connections. So we're always, and I'm sure even there where you are, there's so much to cover in the curriculum. And so for me, inquiry does that. It goes cross-curricular and you can tick off multiple boxes with one thing. And you can get through the curriculum so much easier and so much quicker when you have these cross-curricular connections. And for young children especially, they often don't see those connections. Why do we have to do this? We're never going to do this in our lives when we're adults. But yes, you actually are. And I think just you speaking, my brain started racing. And obviously, this is a great way to make learning visible. I think for teachers, having those learning walls in your staff room, for example, it's not in a document, online anymore. It's not, and correct me if I'm wrong, so it's not like you've got this policy in a file somewhere. It's actually visible. So educators would be able to see their journey and where the school, the culture of the school, where they want to take the school as a whole. So I think that's just mind-boggling, and I can't understand why we don't do more of that, quite frankly.
Yeah. It's unlearning and relearning, right? It's just when we're just humans, right? And we have that lizard brain. And so when we get stressed, and of course, teachers have a lot of things on their plate, we're going to revert to the things that are habits or ways that we experience teaching and learning. So of course, it's at no fault of teachers or leaders for not being able to slow down the transaction of learning, if you will, and create a space to make the thinking visible. Of course, I have to think about Ron Richard and Mark Church and the work that they do with Project Zero and their publications. So really, it's taking that idea of making and keeping our thinking visible. And what happens when we do that? How might we see these cross-curricular connections? And like you said, get to those deeper learning opportunities that we would have missed if we were just ticking off the boxes of our curriculum and working smarter and not harder. I love to, nudge leaders to really anchor their learning wall on their vision statement for their school. Because if we're co-constructing a vision statement together, then we should be really living and breathing that and working towards what that could look like and sound like. So I love to nudge leaders to consider what that might look like as you are delving into PL together or exploring kind of different things, or even just mandated things, if you will, from the district or from other government bodies. how might you take that and think about it through the lens and the frame of the things that you value as a school? Um, and I, again, I love that sentence stem of what happens when we, right? What happens
Yes.
when we put the learning and thinking on display? How might we come together as a community of learners, and what things may we have missed because we kept it in a document or, thrown it into some spreadsheet that we have forgotten about.
That's very true. Now, listen, I'm partway through your book here.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
and I have to say that I really liked the way that you propose that school leaders tackle their leadership role, especially with regards to cultivating a culture of curiosity and inquiry. Could you share with us first? I think you have touched on it, but the catalyst for your book, or actually authoring the book, what made you think, well, you know what, let me write a book?
Yeah, I think over the years, others that I coached or led alongside have always made some sort of really positive claims or comments about the way that I facilitated learning or sat with them as they were planning or reflecting on units of inquiry. And I kind of just fluffed it off as like, well, doesn't everybody do this? Isn't what we do as coaches and as we do as leaders? And the more that I heard that, the more I realized that it's not the norm. And that while well-intentioned, there are pressures that leaders feel and even coaches feel, and they get stuck in their own kind of rat race, if you will. And so I actually had a friend of mine who you probably know, Trevor McKenzie,
Mhm.
make a mention. And he said, it might be worth writing about. And I kind of, again, just said, oh, I don't really know. I can't write anything about it. And ended up sitting with a different colleague of mine at another school who I was a leader with. And we just started to just jot down stories. And then all of a sudden we realized we had a legal pad of paper of all these different stories, of all these different ways that we saw our leadership in a different lens and landscape. So that was the start of just little seeds that people were planting. And then, of course, that imposter syndrome that we all have. And just kind of pushing that to the side and just kind of seeing if this might be something to explore. And man, oh man, did I learn so much about myself through writing the book, Edwina. You think that you know who you are, and then you write a book and you have to peel back all these layers and ask yourself some really hard questions. And then also, I'll say it again, is I go back to the teachers and my learners and I ask them specific questions. What felt different for you? What did this look like compared to other learning experiences? Can you even get more specific around that? And so getting feedback from learners was a very vulnerable experience to be able to ask for, because you don't always know what you're going to get. But hearing their feedback helped me reflect on the ways that perhaps I was leading differently, and then also what I wanted to inspire other leaders to do. And of course, I was inspired by other amazing leaders. When we jumped on this call, I said I lead alongside a really amazing principal. And she's somebody that I continue to lead and learn alongside as well. So being able to take all those little parts and pieces into the writing was something that continued to make it grow into the publication that you have in your hand.
I was thinking, when we sit as teachers, sometimes you want to be led. Sometimes I think teachers just want someone just to tell them, this is the road you have to take. And I think as teachers, we do need that leading from the front, so to speak. But at the same time, I think leaders also need to, as you've just said,
Mhm.
ask the questions. How are you feeling? How are you thinking about this? How might we do this? What do you think will happen when? And I think perhaps maybe that needs to happen more often, especially if schools are on a journey and they have an end point in mind. Maybe they're changing their culture or they want to
Mhm.
improve outcomes, whatever it might be.
Mhm.
Everybody has to be on the same page. So I
Mhm.
think when you're leading from a position of asking rather than
Mhm.
telling, that could
Mhm.
be really powerful for teachers because then they feel part of the team. They feel seen and heard, which I think
Mhm.
very often teachers don't. We just had yesterday here in Western Australia a teacher strike, for example. I think that comes from not being seen and not being heard. So going forward, for teachers to feel valued and validated
Mhm.
is something that is really important for education as a whole.
Yeah, everybody wants to feel seen, and that's probably why you're drawn to an inquiry-based approach to teaching, of course, and learning in the classroom space. And as leaders, we need to model the model, right? If our teachers are not feeling empowered, how do they know how to empower their students? If our teachers are not feeling curious, how are they going to cultivate and create spaces of curiosity in their classroom? So I think that phrase, model the model, although quite simplified, is really something to hang our hats on and to consider that if we want this for others, then we need to be acting in those spaces as well too. And it's a learner-centered approach as well, right? Inquiry is a learner-centered approach to teaching and learning, and so is leading in this mindset. And yes, teachers definitely want to feel seen and empowered and have that sense of agency, which oftentimes that they don't, we don't as educators. And I'd really say that it also needs to be something that's looked at outside of education. This should be a model that leaders all over should be leading, right? Instead of tasking and telling, it's asking and facilitating and providing opportunities for us all to be able to flex dispositions and competencies. I've been really, I can't get through it fast enough. Adam Grant's newest publication, Hidden Potential. I just am underlining, highlighting. He even opens the book with what happens when we cultivate and create spaces with competency development in mind in a kindergarten space. And he shows the research behind that. And I love that's how he starts the book. And he's talking about the importance of this. And so developing competencies or giving opportunities for that competency development for our teachers is something that I am here for the long haul and is my passion, of course, is the work that I get to do. So I couldn't agree more.
And I think teachers really need that support, especially when it comes to inquiry, because it's not something that you learn at university. Yep. And coming back to your book, because you've actually adapted in the book Kath Murdoch's inquiry cycle, and you use that very cycle that teachers use with students, you use them as leaders with your teachers. So that was very interesting because you're actually taking teachers through that inquiry cycle, through the tuning in, the finding out, the whole process, right? Did that happen by accident, or did you just think, well, let's just apply Kath Murdoch's inquiry cycle to teachers?
Yeah, it actually happened because I was asked by my principal to facilitate a parent information session on inquiry and IB. And I had never led a parent information session. And I knew I didn't want to just tell because it just was going to feel like robotic. And it's not the heart of what inquiry was. I knew I wanted the parents to feel it. And within the IB and also education, of course, there's so much jargon and language. And I didn't want that to take away the beauty and the amazing things that I saw in the classroom and I knew was there. So honestly, what I did is I took Kath Murdoch's cycle and I thought about what we were going to be unpacking, and I would write down on little sticky notes what activity or what thing it was, and I placed it along the cycle. And I had all these like little stickies on this sheet of paper and just kind of noticed that that was a frame that could help take the parents and experience inquiry in an hour, if you will, but how that provided almost a safe hold, if you will. That's what I loved about her cycle, and I continue to love about it, is it gives me an entry point to figure out what should I be doing, what kind of thinking do I need to be thinking about or guiding or facilitating for learners. So for me, it provides a structure of safety when, like you said, inquiry is very ambiguous and it can go all these different places and it's really hard. But it was with parents first and using it. And so I continue to use it to this day. Again, in all my coaching work with leaders or helping coaches design professional development, I usually will say, what kind of thinking do you want your learners to engage in? How might you create spaces for them to sort and make connections and collaborate? And we reference that cycle and we use that cycle as a frame for planning professional development as well. But that's where it came to be, again, responding to the moment and to the learners and what they needed.
And I hope that our listeners have picked up on what an inquiry person does, because everything you say is actually a question, right? How might you? Why?
Oh, yeah.
How? Where? And that's how an inquiry specialist functions. We function on questions. That's the food that feeds us. And it's how we get kids to think for themselves, is asking them to consider the options, the opportunities, not telling them, but asking. I think that's how we get people thinking and collaborating and getting more involved in the whole inquiry process. Because so often, and I've even seen it in kids, and one of my colleagues was doing a relief at a school, and she was going, all these kids wanted was for me just to give them the answer. They said, what do I have to do to get the marks? Well, what learning is that, right? If you only have to do something to get the marks, there's no depth to that because you're just going to be regurgitating what the educator says so that you can get a certain grade. And so obviously there must be a culture there of we just feed you this information and then you regurgitate it. That to me is not education. Anybody, you don't even have to have a degree in education. You can just walk into a classroom, pick that up, read from a script, off you go. That's not education. That's not why kids are in our classrooms. They're there for us to help them think, question, find answers, find bias, all these kinds of things. So I think the questioning has to become a part of your culture. You have to learn to ask questions all the time. And so that's just come through for me so strongly with you, that innate questioning that's inside you.
Yeah, shifting the question culture, right? And that questions don't have to always have an answer. But again, our human lizard brain is like searching for an answer to try to make that meaning. So yeah, like unlearning what that is tricky. And of course, as an inquiry educator, you picked that right up. I definitely think in questions. You've nailed that one.
Yeah. I think in questions too all the time, which is not always a good thing though, because sometimes you get into trouble.
As you do.
I remember in high school, my English teacher, as I approached the classroom wanting to jump out of the window, because said, oh, you again. It's me again, the one with questions. With all your years of working with teachers and leaders, Jess, what advice would you give both to teachers and leaders when leading and teaching with a lens of inquiry? Because I'm very big on curiosity, because I think, and I see it every day, we're losing our curiosity. It's apparent everywhere. You see it in the media, you see it in our classrooms. Obviously, curiosity is innate in children. And as they progress through schools, they become less and less curious to the point where they're saying, just give me the work so that I can just finish it and get on with it. But what advice would you give us and to leaders when they teach with this lens of inquiry, or with this inquiry approach, so that we can better nurture curiosity in our children, but also curiosity in our adults, in our teachers, and even in our parents?
Yeah, gosh, that is quite the question, isn't it, Edwina? And I probably answer you in 3 questions.
I love the question.
Yes, just because there's a depth and complexity. I think when I first jumped to inquiry, because it was so overwhelming and so new, asking questions wasn't giving me answers fast enough, because I was looking for the thing, just like you said, tell me this thing. Is this thing the inquiry thing now? Is it now? Is it now? Is it now? And in my experience, both as a classroom teacher and then of course leader and facilitating learning for adults as well, really I think about 3 questions. And no matter where you are in your inquiry journey, as an educator in the classroom or as a leader, these 3 questions tend to give us a depth and breadth to explore and differentiate quite naturally. And the first question is, where might we create opportunities for collaboration? And of course, that could be in collaborative structures, a turn and talk, the way that you're organizing your spaces or your rooms. Like, even just that question alone, if you're a listener, like jot that down and what comes to mind, right? Because we know that inquiry happens together. And so how might we do that together? So where are we creating spaces for collaboration? How might we co-construct understanding together is question number 2. And of course, constructivism comes to mind, I'm sure. How can we step back so that way our learners can step forward? What are the different tools and structures that we have within our tool belt that create those spaces for our learners to be able to walk through, if you will, the inquiry cycle, or to utilize a thinking routine for us to be able to lift up and visualize the thinking that we see, to not jump in right away when there's a misconception that bubbles up, but instead use that as a provocation for the next day or for the next week. So that co-construction piece, again, slows down the transaction of the doing of the products that we often get stuck in, and then creates a different intention for us to show up to the learning, to be that facilitator, to observe, to ask questions, to notice and take in the learning that's unfolding before us. And if our learners can't, then that right there is where we start, right? That is the competency that we know that we need to develop. I'd say that the campus that I currently serve on 5 years ago, that co-construction piece was hard. They just wanted the answers. Just tell me what to do, Jess. Just tell me, is this what you want? Is this what you want? And you probably wouldn't be surprised. I would not tell them the answer right away, but respond to them in a question. And know that that's going to give them skills that they're going to be able to take by far wide and greater than me being there that day, giving them the answer. And then lastly, and this of course, again, is probably no surprise, is how might we document, evidence, and artifact the learning? And what does that tell us when we do that, right? So is it a collection of sticky notes that have some questions on them, but instead of answering them, do we take a look at the landscape of questions and how are our learners asking questions? Is that a skill that we can develop with one another? I love to take a look at questions as a data set and not answer them, but just as kind of, soaking them up. What does this tell me that my learners know? What don't they know? What could they know? Where could we go? What are some other skills that we can focus in on one another across the span of an academic year? Of course, Learning Walls speaks to that. And even within that final question, like you hear the other two questions in there, right? Collaboration and that co-construction should be part of that evidence and that documentation. And I find that those three questions, especially if you are newer to your practice, give you something to have as a check mark, if you will, if you're doing inquiry, right? Okay, are my learners collaborating? Are we creating spaces of co-construction? Do I know what that could look like and sound like, right? And so I'd say learners and teachers using those questions would be a really great start to be able to reflect on, how is your week gone? Where are you spending your time? Is it a lot of tasking and telling? And where there might be space to be able to infuse some of those elements and values within your week. It's not either or, it's both and more, right? So we can still work within the system and use those values that we see threaded throughout to be able to step towards more of an inquiry mindset and an inquiry practice.
Yes, I would agree with everything that you've just said. Now, one of the other things is that, of course, as educators who want to perhaps step into, and please God, please want to, into an inquiry culture and inquiry mindset, one of the things that I've discovered was that kids don't know how to ask questions. Not open-ended questions anyway, not deep questions. Very shallow questions, yes, those that require one answer. That they're very good at. Yeah. But questions that really require some reflection and some thinking and some digging, they honestly don't know how to do that. And that's our fault, as I think, as parents and as teachers. I think if you're starting an inquiry, the best place to start is with questions and with learning how to ask good questions, and simultaneously, I think, explicitly teaching kids what good questions look like. So very often we have this argument about, oh, what about explicit instruction? And people don't understand that the two actually dovetail, because as inquiry teachers, we do have to explicitly teach, especially because these kids don't have an inquiry mindset possibly, or those skills. We have to explicitly teach them those skills and how to ask good questions. So a perfect place to start, as you've just said, ask questions, have it in your mind to constantly be asking questions, not just jumping into the answer. Take a few seconds. Silence is golden, they say. Just take a few seconds and let it percolate away. Jess, this has been an amazing chat with you. Is there anything that you would like to leave listeners with? A little nugget with all the other wonderful nuggets you've left us today. Are there any other little nuggets you'd like to leave educators and leaders?
Yeah, there's one other element, and that is having a critical friend and thought partner. I did say that inquiry is better together and we do it together. But I'd say by far and away, my practice has grown leaps and bounds because I've brought in critical friends and thought partners. And they're not always people who agree with what it is that I'm sharing, right? Who'll nudge me with a question or give me a little bit of feedback. And so there's a handful of critical friends and thought partners who I seek, for advice to be able to like get their feedback on something that I'm kind of putting together, or, even my principal definitely is a really great thought partner. I'll share some of the things that I've learned on a learning walk. And being able to have that perspective and her experience is really helpful. And so when you pull in that critical friend and thought partner, of course, sometimes we just have to vent on our days, but really a critical friend and thought partner is there to be able to be that other perspective and mirror, perhaps, to ask you the questions, to help you sort things through. And so I couldn't do what I do alone. And even in consultancy world, like I'm always reaching out and reconnecting with my learners. It's not, let me close the door and get on the airplane and leave. It's, how is the learning impacting you now? What are you realizing in your practice? And kind of going back and continuing to be those thought partners with one another is something that I really, really value about my consultancy and leadership. It's something that I really, that everyone can learn from and continue to be able to be and remain curious, just as you've said, is quite critical for us all.
I think that is a great place
Mhm.
for everybody. And I think you have to put your ego aside, right? 'Cause so many people are so afraid of having someone in their classroom, for example.
Yeah.
But I think if you want to grow as an educator, as a practitioner, as a leader, you do need that feedback, that constant feedback from a critical friend, as you say. I think that's important for growth, isn't it?
Mhm. Most definitely. And you're right. You have to put yourself out there and be vulnerable. And again, what happens when we do, right? What are our blind spots, our biases that we didn't necessarily know? And every time I've done that and taken a risk, I've always been surprised and I've always grown and stretched in some new ways. So encouraging your listeners to do that as well too.
And that's what it's about, isn't it? For people
Mhm.
who are into inquiry,
Mhm.
it's about growing and stretching and being brave and putting your fears aside, because I believe inquiry gives you your mojo back. So if you are someone who's stuck and you're bored and you perhaps are getting quite negative about the profession, which I see a lot on social media, I'm actually not even looking at that anymore because I think it's awful how so many people are just so negative about a profession that has such a profound impact on the future. I think making yourself vulnerable and developing this inquiry mindset and just saying, how can I ask questions? How can I get kids excited about coming into my classroom? And I think
Mhm.
inquiry, because of its nature, because of its messiness, it's not clear. And it's exciting as an educator. To be an inquiry practitioner is really exciting because you just never know what you're going to get. So for someone
Mhm.
who gets bored really easily, which is
Mhm.
what I do,
Yep.
that's what keeps me going is the inquiry
Mhm.
process, because you
Mhm.
can never get bored because you just never know what you're going to get.
Mhm.
So I would urge any educators listening, please adopt an inquiry mindset and reach out to
Mhm.
people to
Mhm.
help you to nurture it. And because you'll get your mojo back. You'll love your job.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's not about perfection, but
No.
unfolding towards one another and a community that's really quite something and really quite beautiful. So I couldn't agree more.
I think that's a beautiful note to end. That really is a wonderful way to teach and a wonderful way to inspire children to be curious, which is exactly what we need in our world today is we need curious thinkers. So Jess, I'd like to thank you so much for being on Blooming Curious today. And I hope you'll come back again another time.
Anytime.
And thank you for being such an inspiration to myself and to all the other educators and leaders out there who are thinking about changing the way we do things for the better.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. And I'd love to come back soon.
I'm sure you'll agree that having Jessica on the podcast today was just an amazing experience. I'm sure you are all inspired to give inquiry a go. And if there's anything about this episode that you really appreciated, why not leave us a review? Next week, we're going to talk all about questioning, how to ask questions and the types of questions that are just great for an inquiry educator to ask to get kids curious and thinking. So don't forget to subscribe and follow, and I'll see you all next week. And until then, stay blooming curious.